Well, again, good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, it's great to see you on this holiday weekend. For many, this is the last weekend of travel as we move into fall. We're starting a new month. We're kind of moving into a new season. For some of you, your families, it's the launch of school and your activity level is about to pick up. For us as a church, this is always the time of the year when things begin to ramp up as we move into a new academic year, and there'll be new opportunities for you to get involved as we move through the month. We'll be talking more about that, but even as we're looking forward now, this morning I want to begin by looking back. If you were with us a few months ago, you may remember that over a course of several weeks, we did this church pulse survey, and the goal of the survey was just to kind of take the pulse of how we're doing as a church and how people are doing individually. And as we processed the results from that survey, there were really two themes that we flagged, two themes where we said, hey, this is something to pay attention to. One was the theme of relationships, and the other was the theme of individual well-being. And for many of us, these were, in essence, things where we said, you know, it would be great if we were doing better in this area. These are areas where there's room for growth. And so that's really influenced how we're planning this next academic year. And as I thought about those two themes, as I've been thinking about those two themes, my mind went to kind of a very familiar statement made by Jesus. It's found in John chapter 13. It's where Jesus gathers his disciples, and they gather to celebrate the Passover. Even as we can gather around, a table for a shared meal, they gather to celebrate this very sacred event. It was the moment when Jesus was going to give his disciples their final teaching, their final instructions before his arrest and the experiences that we will celebrate when we get to Easter. And as they gathered and shared that meal together, Jesus said these words: "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Now, as you look at that very familiar statement, let me highlight two things for you. First of all, notice how he begins, "A new command I give you." Now, the natural question is, what's new about this command? Remember, everyone seated in that room, seated sharing this meal, they're all Jewish. They're all familiar with the Old Testament law. They're all familiar with Leviticus 19, which says you're to love your neighbor as yourself. It's even a text that Jesus has used in his own teaching. How can he say this is new? Well, it's new because of the context in which it's given. This is a new command because it's now rooted in the new work of Jesus Christ. It's rooted in the fact that through the cross, the resurrection, he is now establishing a new covenant, a new way for us to relate to God. And through that new covenant, we are entering into a new way of life. It's the way of life that was central to Jesus in all of his teaching. He described it as the kingdom of God. In fact, in his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, arguably the theme of that sermon is this: you will flourish when you live as part of my kingdom. So central to what Jesus is saying here is this: it's an invitation to a new way of life. But notice not only this invitation to a new way of life, notice that central to this new way of life are the relationships that are to be a part of our life, right? By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Jesus, through his cross work, is inviting us into a new way of life. He's inviting us into a life of flourishing, and central to that is how we relate to one another. Central to that are the relationships that we are to have. And so foundational to this teaching that comes right at the end of Jesus' public ministry is an invitation to connect well and live well. And as we launch into the fall, even as we move throughout the next year, we're going to seek to give you opportunities to do that. We'll really begin digging into this more next week. But as we get started, we wanted to start by just talking about families. And I think we're doing that for a couple of reasons. First of all, right, this is the time of year when family schedules pick up. If you're part of a family, this is the time of the year when things may be getting busy for you. And consequently, because you're getting busy, it's going to be harder to connect well over this next year during the school year. So how do we get off to a good start? I think a more kind of global reason why it's important for us to talk about families is this. We've got to understand we live at a cultural moment where across our nation, and really even across the world, we are seeing a rising level of mental health issues among our kids, among our students. Let me just show you this graph. And you see kind of the depressive symptoms among teenagers really begins to jump, actually starting around 2012, and it has just continued to go up. And we need to pay attention to that as a church. And part of the reason, or part of the way we do that is in investing in our families. So this morning, we just want to talk some with you about how we can connect well as families. And to have that conversation, I'm going to invite members of our family ministry team to join me up here. Would you help me in welcoming these folks? Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you for doing this. Even though you had no choice, thank you for doing this. Thank you for your work. This was their idea. So I'm going to let you guys, Deb, we're going to start with you. Just going to let you each introduce yourself and kind of your role as part of this team.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Deb Hinkle, and my role here is as the Director of Spiritual Formation and Family Ministry. So that's how I get to be part of this team. On the screen behind me is the motley crew called the Hinkle family. And you notice that we were at a restaurant because we do like to connect over a meal. We're good at eating together. So this is a picture of my three sons, Andrew, Stephen, and Josh. Their families, their wives. So Andrew's married to Heidi, and they have two children, Sarah and Noah. Stephen is single, he lives in Denver, and then our other son, Josh, is married to Stephanie, and they have Sophie.
Good.
Right. Hi, I'm Katrina Brown. I'm the Director for Children's Ministries here. I will not go through everyone's names that you see on the screen. This is our family. My husband and I, we've been married 31 years. We have 7 children, 9 grandchildren, and 2 more grandchildren on the way. So our oldest just turned 30, and yep, that's all of us.
That's great. That's a wonderful picture. Awesome.
Hi, I'm Nick Mance. I'm the pastor for student ministries here at Hershey Free. On the screen behind me, as only a student pastor would. In the first picture, that is my amazing wife, Elise. We've been married for 11 years now. To the right, because our cat is oh so photogenic when you're trying to touch her, that is our cat who really runs our house. That's Jade. And that's not an uncommon position for her if I tried to touch her. So, yeah.
My name is Bridget. I am the Associate for Student Ministries. Up on the screen, you'll see my wonderful husband, Josiah, who you will most often find sitting in the back behind the soundboard. And this is our dog, Wally, who is the rambunctious toddler who runs our house.
Well, Deb, I know helping families connect, working with families is a passion of your team. In fact, last year, about this time, we introduced the framework we call It Matters. So why don't you just remind us of what that looks like and what we're trying to do in terms of partnering with families.
Sure. So after a number of years of working on this project, and it did take time, the family ministry team created this, and I'm going to call it a guidebook in a sense, because it's not a guarantee in terms of how this will help you raise and disciple your children, but it gives you guidelines and guardrails in essence to go by. And so the It Matters book is a way of partnering together, the church and the ministries that we have here at the church, with you as parents and grandparents, and how you can disciple your children in a spiritually formative way. And so if you look at inside the book, there is something called 4 pillars, which really are stages that the children go through, children and teens, and we want to guide them at each one of those stages. And so we start by nurturing them, even when they're babies, starting in the nursery. And then we build on that as they get older, and then as they go into middle school and high school, we desire to guide them and then eventually launch them when they leave the home. So that's kind of an overview. If you haven't picked one up, I'd really encourage you to do so.
Right, and I think we've got copies in that lobby, the blue lobby, as well as in the Kids Step area. So we'd love, if you haven't picked one up yet, we'd love for you to get a copy. Now, as we were talking about today and talking about helping families connect, I think a topic that really bubbled to the surface was the importance of conversations, particularly mealtime conversations. That's why we're kind of seated around a table. So Deb, just a couple of questions. Why do you think that's important? But also, what would you say to some people who would say that just doesn't work for me, or it doesn't work for us?
Right. So we saw some mental health statistics earlier, and also, there were some statistics that I was researching that said teens feel like they talk best around the table. Now, some of you that have teenagers may not always feel that way, or you may remember your teenage years and think, oh yeah, I gave a lot of one-word answers at that point in my life. But I think the point of understanding getting together and connecting is that actually mealtime is a really good time to do that. And in the book, Habits of the Household, which we may refer to as well later, they talk about the fact that a keystone habit is your mealtime. Now, some of you may say, this is just too hard. And I recognize that busyness is the enemy of us connecting, especially around the table. But what I would say is just persevere. Don't give up, because I think the hard thing is when you feel like you're not making progress, you just quit. And so don't. Just know that, keep a vision in mind of why this is important, and keep going, press on.
You've got to have the long-term perspective.
Yep, exactly.
Well, since we're talking about conversations, particularly mealtime conversations, I'm just curious, what's this been like in your family? We'll just go around and
Okay.
what's it look like for you guys?
Yeah, I can start that off. So for most of our married life, Mark, my husband, worked shift work, much to the bane of my life, I guess I would say. He loved it. I did not so much. But what I'm saying is there were challenges in having us have a mealtime together because of work schedules. As our kids got older, they were involved in sports and other activities, and so it made it really challenging. And then another layer that I added to that is I started working at a church where I served on the church staff team. And so it became really haphazard. It wasn't that we didn't want to, but it was challenging. And so when I started working at the church, Mark came to me and he said, we're going to go out to eat on Sundays. He said, because he knew I didn't really like to cook. I still don't like to cook. And so that was a way of us gathering together. Now, let me tell you, it wasn't exactly high-class four-star restaurants. Sometimes it was just Pizza Hut or something that, it was never McDonald's, but it could have been hamburgers. But the point was, it was a connecting point. And I can tell you that we still do that 30 years later. With the family that is still around, there are often meal times on Sunday after church, and it has become a point of connection.
For me growing up, my mom and dad both worked at a Christian school, and our lives centered around the school and church, and so we were very scheduled. We had breakfast and dinner together every day and left the house together, came home late together, and all of that. Of course, our married life, my husband Nick and I, I was a stay-at-home mom for a while, and we had a regular dinner every night. As our kids have grown and grown and grown, our seasonal, it's very different seasonally, whether they're in sports, whether they're working, so we've had to make it maybe once a week where we form that connection. We're still connecting with whoever's in and out the door, and we haven't always been perfect at that, so, but we do try to connect, and even our grown married children that come home now, we always gather around a meal. I will say this, if I can show a prop. This is my explanation of dinner at our house. It says it's a noun, and it is a family competition to see who can talk the loudest. That's exactly what embodies our dinner at home. Those of you who've been to our house for dinner, you know that is accurate. So.
Yeah, for my family, growing up there were 4 boys and 1 girl, and so probably similar to your kids' experience, it's always like insane. When you try to wrangle, especially when it was just us 4 boys, and you try to wrangle us all for a meal time, we primarily would focus on the food. But the one thing that stood out to me was, especially for dinner time, my dad is a civil engineer, and his hours always varied, like when he would get home, and it was never consistent. But my mom would always say, hey, we're waiting for Dad. Like, we'd always wait for Dad to get home. And again, with 4 boys who live as if they're starving every moment of their life, like, that wasn't always fun. But what I always remember is Dad would come home, we'd sit around the table, and we had no distractions. I mean, I'll date myself a little bit. We didn't have cell phones at that stage in technology, and so we didn't have that. But like books or things that we were playing with, we couldn't bring them to the table because we were supposed to engage with one another. I just remember my dad even being exhausted, just being intentional and asking us how our days had been, how we were doing. We got to ask him. We never knew what he was talking about when we asked him, but we asked him. And even after that, just like for Elise and I, just how my parents embodied that, how her parents even embodied pieces of that. The table for us has just become a place of hospitality, of community, of love, and it's a place where, I mean, our family right now, minus the cat, is us. Our family all lives out of state, and we use it as an opportunity to engage with people in our community. We host meal times around our table, and similar to what you said, like, it's just, if you can't talk the loudest, you probably won't get heard, but it's a place of just love and community and fellowship, and that's really what's become central to our table.
Growing up for me, my parents treated the dinner table with the precision and routine that only an engineer could ever possibly. So when I reflect on family dinners growing up, I just remember the just absolute routineness of it. So like we would all sit in the exact same place after my dad got home from work. We would hold hands and we would pray the exact same prayer, so much so that I could probably still repeat it for you verbatim if I tried. I won't, but underneath all of that routineness, something I've kind of reflected upon is the routine was more of a replacement for genuine connection growing up. While yes, we definitely put on the right step of every night we have our family dinner together, something that was missing from those family dinners was genuine connection. Oftentimes growing up, I felt more so like my parents treated the dinner table as an opportunity to move through the checklist of, okay, Bridget and Bethany, my older sister, they are talking correctly about their peers, their grades are high enough. You know, we kind of moved through the motions, and if anything wasn't meeting those checklist requirements, it was an opportunity to kind of swoop in and make sure we were on the right path. And while I love my parents, they were amazing. Growing up, they were so loving. They did err very heavily on the side of correction rather than just taking the opportunity to genuinely hear my sister and I. And what this ended up creating in my family was, while yes, we would sit together every night and we would share a meal, we weren't actually genuinely connecting. And what ended up happening over time is the family dinner wasn't so much as a touch point as a family where we could all get together and really connect, but it was more of an obligation that I was eager to escape. Something that ended up happening as I grew up is, so my dad passed away when I was in high school, and those cracks in our family connection really showed themselves in the dinner table, which is that without my dad, the precise engineer holding that together, family dinner fell apart. I could probably count on my hands the number of times that my mom, my sister, and I shared a meal together while I was in high school, so much so that I became more like a roommate with my family as opposed to an actual family that was connecting. what ended up happening in our grief was, rather than coming together around the table, we kind of fractured apart. And again, it had nothing to do with the table itself. It was more that the table reflected a crack that was already there. Now that I'm older, I'm married, my family looks a lot different now, as it's me and Josiah. Something that has been so important to the two of us as we've been through the early stages of marriage is really taking opportunities at mealtime to connect. Like, some of my fondest memories in my marriage are cooking together and then sitting on the couch and sharing a meal and just taking the opportunity to genuinely dig into each other's lives and actually hear what's happening. And that has become such an important value of mine, to actually take the time to genuinely connect rather than moving through motions.
Well, thank you. And thank you. That's a heavy experience. But I mean, just hearing these different stories, obviously, there are a range of experiences. So having thought a little bit about your experience, what advice would you give? And particularly this year, we're wanting to help people connect well and live well. And so as we think about that in families and mealtime, what advice would you give to do this well?
I would just say make it a habit. As we were reflecting on doing this today, it really did make me think about the fact that for more than 30 years, that's been the tradition, that's been the habit for Sunday. I can't say that the conversations have always been especially deep, or that we've always challenged each other spiritually, but there is still something, at least for me, of looking at it as a habit, something that you just plan to do. It just becomes the rhythm. And so I would really encourage you to figure out how to find mealtime to be a habit of connection. And I would say, for me, there is a little bit of a regret that we didn't make it more intentional. So as you gather, also look for ways to potentially make it more intentional. Ask questions. It may be that part of your mealtime is in a van somewhere, all right? You're transporting kids from place to place. What kind of conversations can you have while you're doing that? And maybe for those of you that aren't married or don't have families at home anymore, you can make it a habit to get together with a friend and share a meal together and be intentional about building that relationship. So I think it's simple things. It's not, we have to meet together 7 nights a week and we have to do X, Y, and Z. I think it's just simple things, but making that a rhythm, a habit.
Okay, so you asked, you raised the issue of ask good questions. So give me some examples of good questions to ask around the table.
Well, I felt like I was awful at it. I just want you to know. So if I could have a redo, I would go back and I would ask more open-ended questions. And so questions, and I would be the one who started the answers. So as parents, you need to engage. This is not like an inquisition and you're asking your kids, what was your day like? Fine. So what was the best thing of your day? What was the hardest thing? Was there something that was really fun today that you did? And then you're going to answer that too. And you might say, there is nothing fun about my day today, and here is why. I did bring these up. These are called talking point cards. And this could just be a fun way to have conversations around the table, because you can pull the cards out. And I think it would be really fun if you pulled this card out. If you were famous, what do you want to be famous for? And somebody might say, I don't want to answer that question. And so they pass and they answer it again. Or you can make it a game and say, I don't want to answer it, but I'm going to make Dad answer that question. And so just again, connecting points, those kinds of questions that allow for thoughtful and fun answers.
Yeah, I remember conversations that went like this. Okay, so what was the most interesting part of your day? Dad, nothing was interesting. I was at school. Okay, what was the most boring part of your day? We had
The
that
whole
kind
day,
of,
right?
Yeah, we had that dialogue. Katrina, what would you say?
Well, to go on that, if I said to my kids, what's the most boring part of your day, they'd probably say this right now. So they'd
Fair
say,
enough.
let's talk.
Right.
For advice, I would probably speak to myself more than anything, because we still do have some kids at home, and I would say listen well. we ask these questions. And don't just ask them to go to the next question, but ask them to genuinely listen well to form those connect points. And as Bridget said, so you're not just sounding like you're, okay, I asked the questions, they gave me a couple word answers, and we can move on to the next thing.
So how do I know if I'm listening well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Should we discuss that around the table? One thing I know is very tempting for me in particular. I don't know if my husband struggles with this as much as I do, but I always feel like I have to bring it around to the right answer or to the right solution. And maybe just avoiding that temptation a little bit so that we can listen more instead of feeling like we're, okay, thanks for sharing your part, and I'm going to bring it to the right thing, and then we'll go on. And I know that's a big temptation, so avoiding that maybe is helping me to listen well.
Yeah, I think I would echo exactly what Katrina and Deb have said. I think the habit of asking open-ended questions is huge, especially as you engage with students. I know as my brothers and I grew up, there were times we were not super vocal around the table. And if you ask a question that facilitates a one-word response, a one-word response you will get. But if you ask those open-ended questions, right, of hey, how did you experience happiness or joy today? Where did you see Jesus today? What made you feel sad or overwhelmed? What was difficult about today? Or how did you show somebody else love and care? Did you have the opportunity to share Jesus with somebody? What happened? When you ask questions like that, you ask them hey, what was a high or a low, or what we talk about in chorus, what you're happy, what you're crappy. And it's when you put those things out there, you're opening up the door, but then it goes into listening well to those responses and then speaking life into one another's life. It's not just going, oh, hey, great answer, and moving on. It's digging deeper, it's asking the questions, it's listening well, and not, like Katrina said, not just to give the right answer or respond, but to walk with one another, seeking to understand. What students and kids are going through, our culture is ever shifting and evolving, so giving them the opportunity to share openly without having to fear being told what to do all the time, or what's right, what's wrong, how they messed up, and instead of having the opportunity just to be honest and transparent and know there's no condemnation, is huge. And then what you do is you walk with them. And I think another thing for me is when you're speaking life into one another's lives, I think one of the most important things you can do is to use phrases like, I'm proud of you, good job, I love you. One of the hardest things for me looking back is I remember the very first time my dad told me he was proud of me. And I'm sure my dad does too, because it was later in my life. And it's one of those things that I look at now and I'm one of the best things that you can do when speaking life into your kids is to let them know you see them, you're proud of them, and you love them. Kids are gonna mess up, we all do. We're gonna mess up. I mean, George has to tell me once a week at least I mess up. But it's when you can still stand there in the midst of mistakes and look at your kids and say, you still matter. You still have a place at this table. And I love you regardless. You're going to see those meal times, those times around the table, whatever that looked like, you're going to see them flourish and blossom in the great moments.
Just continuing to build off of what these guys have said, my encouragement is to start patterns of communication early. Start them as soon as you can, and not just patterns of communication, but emotional rapport. And what I mean by that is a lot of times I think what a barrier is for either children or teenagers or anyone is when they're asked, well, how was your day? And you get, it was good. That is oftentimes a reflection of, I'm not actually comfortable discussing what my day was actually like because I'm not sure how my experiences or emotions will be received. Sometimes it's just that pattern of emotionally connecting hasn't been built. Sometimes it's just because they fear they'll be shut down with, well, this is what you need to do, straight to correction, straight to the right thing to do, rather than just hearing. And that's my encouragement, is to, and when you're in a conversation, this is not just to parents with your children, this is to anybody. When you're in conversation, seek to genuinely be curious about what they're experiencing in life, what's happening, and then just move to empathy. I promise there will always be time and room to move towards that growth aspect, right? It's I think that building emotional rapport with someone gives you the perfect avenue to move them towards growth, especially when you're interacting with your child or your student, and like you're trying to guide them. But I think that guidance starts with just strong emotional rapport and really being able to connect and trust each other emotionally. I know that was the big barrier for me with my parents growing up, because we didn't have that emotional connection established. That was where a lot of distance began to form. And my encouragement as well is, if you don't feel like you have that sort of emotional connection, whether it's with your child or with another member of your family or even with a friend, those connections can always be built, and it's not too late to start. I won't sugarcoat it. It is harder the longer you wait, especially once patterns of not communicating are developed. But it isn't too late to start, and it's so important to just be willing to sit down and just genuinely hear. And even if you're like listening and you're like, wow, I don't know how I feel about what you're saying right now, just to pause and just hear it. And then just wait for the Spirit to guide you towards, okay, how can I walk with this person? How can I guide them while just allowing them the space to be heard?
Okay, so Nick, one final question. So we talked in some ways primarily to parents. So what would you say to students in this conversation?
Yeah, I think for students, the first thing I would point out is acknowledge this can feel uncomfortable. I'm just going to put it out there, if this hasn't been a rhythm, if this isn't something you're used to around the table, there may be some awkwardness at first, but students also realize it's awkward for your parents, okay? It's not just awkward for you. They feel uncomfortable too. A lot of times older people just get better at not showing that all the time. But just because it's awkward doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I would encourage you, I know there are times where, even at core, you might be asked a question in a small group, and the first time you're asked a question, it might feel awkward, but as it continues to grow, and like Bridget was saying, you're building that relational rapport, you're building that equity there, you start to see it blossom and flourish. And the reality is, if you come in good faith and your parents come in good faith to this, and you say, hey, we're willing to engage with this, even if it might be awkward at first, you're gonna see that this practice, this rhythm, just helps you to flourish and grow. You're going to see the impact on your life, not just at that table, but as you engage with one another. And let me encourage you to, especially the students and the parents, leave devices outside of the table. Get rid of them. Yeah, and some people are like, yeah, praise God. But for real, they are distractions. I don't know if you're like me, maybe I'm just weird, but you get that phantom leg vibration where your leg just kicks and you think your phone's going off. Take it out of your pocket, take your Apple Watch off, put it to the side. Be focused in the moment. We have so many things that are grasping for our attention on the day in, day out. And if we truly want to engage in intentional, authentic community, we need to put the distractions to the side. And so students, I'm going to challenge you to lead out in that, because I know you've done it. I've seen you do it. In fact, one of the greatest things that we get to hear is after we take trips, we tell our students, you go on a trip with us, we take all your devices. And usually it's the parents who get upset with us for some reason or another. And they're like, but I need them. No, they're good, trust me. And what we hear after that is that the students come back and go, you have no idea how good I felt. Because I got to talk to people, I built relationships. And it's refreshing. And talking to our upperclassmen who've done it for 6-7 years, they're like, Nick, our favorite part of core is not when you talk. It's when we go on trips and you take our phones away. They go because we're free. And if we can practice that type of mentality, and students, I'm talking to you because you've already led out in that. You know that experience. If you lead out in that and you leave distractions to the side and you engage in conversations, I can promise you two things. One, you're going to grow, but you're also going to impact the rest of your family to see them grow as well. Okay. And so I would just say, disconnect and then connect relationally, and you're going to see what God does in your life and the lives of those around you.
That's good. Well, team, thank you so much for thanks for sharing part of your own story, but also thanks for just the ways in which you're investing in our kids and our families. Would you help me thank our family ministers for your time? Now, we heard a little bit from them, and what I'm going to do is just give you just a little moment to have some conversation with the people around you. You might want to move if you're by yourself, but here's the question I want you just to talk just a moment about is, what was mealtime like for you growing up. So, if you're in a family now, you can even, hey, what might it look like for us? But I'm going to give you just a little bit of time just to have that conversation.
You're a scientist and a sales guy.
Hey, everyone, I hope you've had some good conversation. I'm going to bring us back together. Hope you heard some good stories. Since you've been sharing stories, I'll just share one. So I had this conversation with my sons this week about family meal times. And in talking to one, I said, so what was the highlight? And I was waiting for this really profound relational response. He just looks at me and goes, he went, Chinese takeout. So a shout out to Jasmine Restaurant on Hummelstown, Middletown Road, who's contributed a lot to our family over the last decade. Thank you for sharing. And now I realize for some of you, maybe it's like, okay, George, this has kind of been interesting, and I know the church wants to invest in families, but I'm not a part of a family, or I'm not in that season anymore. That's not been part of my life, so what does this have to do with me? Well, if that's kind of where you're at, let me take you back to where we started, right? Remember we started with that quote from Jesus as he was gathered, not exactly around a table, but gathered with his disciples. And remember, they were sharing a meal together. And it was Passover. And then interestingly, according to Jewish custom and practice, Passover was normally celebrated within your family. And so part of what Jesus was doing in that situation as he was gathering with his disciples and as he would ultimately institute what we know as the Lord's Supper, communion, he was helping them understand that, just as we can be part of biological families, church is also to be family. In fact, as you read the pages of the New Testament, one of the most profound images of the church, according to multiple New Testament authors, is the image of family. And so in a real sense, when we celebrate communion together, we're gathering around the table. This is intended to be a family meal because we're now part of this family. So appropriately, then, we're now going to, in essence, close our service with communion. And as we do that, first of all, I hope you remember the work of Jesus Christ that makes what we're talking about possible. The cross and resurrection of Christ, and through that work, the ability to experience forgiveness of sin and to be ushered into a new way of life, to become participants in the kingdom of God. And if you have yet to start that journey, we want you to know this can be the place where you begin the journey of following Jesus as a disciple by putting your faith and trust in him. And we would love to help you do that. So as we come to the table, I want you to remember the person and work of Christ, but also I want you to understand that work creates new relationships. And even as we begin this new academic year, we're going to be talking more about what those relationships can look like and how they contribute to human flourishing. But all of that is made possible through the work of Jesus Christ. And so even as we celebrate this together, I just want you to remember the work of Christ and this forgiveness and this new life. But I also want you to be open to the fact that perhaps there are ways in which God is really seeking to be at work in and through your relationships over the next year. And will you be open to that? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to lead us in prayer. Our worship team is going to come up, and you see we've got these trays spread out throughout different sections of our room, and what I'm going to ask is just if one or two people in each section, as our worship team plays, we just come up and grab some trays and just serve the people in your section, just as part of your family. And then in a moment, I will come back and we will celebrate this together. So, would you join me in prayer? Father, this morning we have talked about families, and I pray particularly for the families in our church. I realize for some of us, this is the time when really the schedule begins to take off. Our activities become multiple, our calendars become filled, and I do pray in the midst of that as families we could launch into this new academic year well with a desire to truly connect with one another. But Father, even at a deeper level, I pray that as we begin this year, that as a church family, we're going to come really to a new and fresh understanding of the ways in which relationships are part of your kingdom and what it looks like to thrive in the midst of that. And so now we come to the table because this is the work that makes all of that possible. And I pray that in Jesus' name, amen. Let's come to the table.